Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Shaykhna.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Shaykh, in our previous episodes we discussed the notion of evil, and primarily we discussed the arguments used by atheists to disprove or object the existence of God. Now, as Muslims, can we turn the table and use the notion of good and evil to prove the existence of God and prove the necessity of these elements in our lives?
Yeah, of course. I do think that, as we showed in the previous episode, there is sufficient evidence to show that atheists have no good reason to even talk about morality. And so if they're unable to talk about objective good and bad, then it's kind of difficult to help an argument from evil. In addition to that, I mean, we could always opt with the option of saying that we live in a naturalistic universe and our minds have developed in this random, uncontrolled process of unguided evolution and chaotic outbursts, in which case we're depending upon something which was produced from chaos in order to give us order and structure in an argument like the argument from evil. So again, that would undermine the atheists on the argument from evil. That's two factors you could use. But I do think there's something far more simplistic, and that is, of course, the argument from a former atheist himself, C.S. Lewis, who correctly points out that what does it mean to say that a line is crooked? What does it mean to say that a path is distorted if you yourselves can't point to a straight line? And he argues that I used to despise religion and hate the concept of God because of all the suffering I used to see in the world. But then, in seeing all that suffering, I realized that there must be a standard by which I myself am actually measuring the universe up to. That is to say for example, if I'm outraged by something, what would be the purpose and cause and reason for that outrage were that thing not outrageous? It could either be my subjective desires, or it could be that there's something actually objectively outrageous with it. Now, if there is something objectively outrageous with it, what would that be? And I believe that this goes back to the saying of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salatu wassalam, who says that عرفت Allah بفسخ العزائم, that I came to know Allah Azza wa Jal by nothing that I had planned going the way I wanted it to. And it goes back to what Imam al-Rida alayhi salatu wassalam says when he says to one of his companions, أتدرون ما هي مشكلتك? Do you know what your problem is? المشكلة إنك تبحث عن المستحيل تبحثون عن الراحة في الدنيا. The problem is you look for that which is impossible. You look for comfort and permanent comfort, of course, in this world. This world is never meant to be a world of comfort. And I think that this goes back to a brilliant argument which is used by one of our great ulama in a book entitled 40 Hadith. There's no need to mention the names of ulama. He's forgotten which one it is anyway. Who argues that the fitrah guides us to this need. What's the argument? The argument is put forward by C.S. Lewis in the Christian world, and of course this great scholar in the Muslim world. The argument goes like this. As psychologists have stated, for every natural desire we have, there corresponds to that natural desire in the real world something that satiates it. So for example, every baby is born requiring something that would satiate its thirst, hence why he gets thirsty. Every human being requires something that would satiate his hunger, hence why he gets hungry. These are natural desires. Every human being can potentially, if he works hard enough or she works hard enough, find a mate that would satisfy that natural desire that they have as well. Now, these are what we call natural desires. Now, I want to point out that a desire for a red Ferrari is not a natural desire, because I would have first needed to know what a car is and what these colors are, and someone would need to introduce it to me as to why this car is better than that one in order for me to want it. No, a natural desire is those things that we want intrinsically, without anyone inspiring us with external inspiration. But if every natural desire corresponds to something that exists, why is it that every human being has a natural desire for comfort, has a natural desire for them to be comfortable and at peace without struggle and difficulty? We would argue that this natural desire corresponds to something real, and it corresponds to our desire to enter into a relationship with Allah Azza wa Jal and reach that final destination, which is Jannah.
Hassan Naib, could it not be argued that good and evil, or our understanding of morality or good and evil, is an innate sort of survival mechanism that we have? For example, we would conclude that killing is evil, for example, and that's not something that's been inspired to us by a creator, that's just something innately within us.
Right. See, definitely we could argue that the 4 F's, fighting, fleeing, food, and reproduction, are definitely things that would be inspired by evolution, the will to survive. What would not be inspired by the will to survive are things like the ability to do complex mathematics, the ability to rationalize things, the ability to produce literature, art. And so the very fact that the human being isn't like that shows that we're not merely a product of random unguided will to survive. And more importantly, I think they must be pointed out here, that according to a strict Darwinian way of looking at life, a Darwinian worldview where we literally take Darwinian evolution as what would guide us in how we do things, then that would mean that Hassan Naib wants his genes to come out dominant in society. And how's he going to do that? Killing as many males possible and marrying and having offspring with as many women as possible. That's the Darwinian way of life. So I don't know how we're going to argue that morality itself has evolved as a product of Darwinian survival ethic.
Absolutely.
And if anything, Dawkins has actually said that please don't implement like Darwinism as a model for morality. Yeah, he's actually said it.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Sheikhna. If we were to accept the notions of good and evil and its existence, could it not be argued that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could be both good and evil at the same time? Could there be such thing as an evil God?
No, because you see, you and I, when we do something which is evil, we do something which is evil for what we perceive as personal benefit. We need to achieve something, we want to do something, and therefore, unfortunately, some people are going to get harmed in the way. Or we're going to have to break a few laws which we shouldn't normally have broken on the way. That's quite different to someone who's the creator of everything and requires nothing. You see, we do evil because we do so in order to satisfy some cheap desires that we have. Someone who is all-powerful and controls everything has no reason to be evil because it's a negative trait. And of course, the definition of Allah Azza wa Jal given by all philosophers is the greatest conceivable being, not something that would have these negative traits, so to speak.
So, if I'm not mistaken, God's actions or God's will can be perceived as evil by human beings. However, given the finite wisdom that we have, we haven't sort of perceived it in the correct way or interpreted it in the correct way.
Yeah, we could interpret something happening to us as being cruel and unnecessary suffering. But at the end of the day, Allah Azza wa Jal, in His infinite wisdom, would have a reason for why He's doing that. And I advise every viewer who's confused by this to just refer back to the story of Musa and Khidr, because it's very, very clear that there are certain things that we don't understand. And even, especially as Shia, we're talking about this. the early Shia community was completely baffled when the Ghaiba happened, because they could have never understood a world in which they would be tested with this ibtila of not having an imam present that they could go and ask these questions to. And even, the suffering that was experienced by the Ahlul Bayt, there are many, many things which are confusing to people, but it doesn't mean that there's not a hidden hikmah behind them.
But to me, that's just like saying, well, this is good for you. However, your mind or your brain is limited and you will not understand it. So just go along with what we're saying. We know what's best for you.
Well, can you imagine if we were able to have plugged in a computer that could have told me what my daughter was thinking, in that analogy I gave you, where I actually did have to help a doctor stick a massive syringe into her? I imagine it would sound something like, I want to run away, I want someone else to take me away from you, stay away from me, I don't love you, you don't love me. Because it would have been impossible for me to explain to my young daughter why you need to take this vaccination. Her vocabulary wouldn't have accepted it. Even if I could have plugged her into a computer that would give her all the vocabulary in the world, the concepts that she has in her mind wouldn't be able to comprehend what a disease is, what a vaccination is, and all these other things. So there are many things which we can never comprehend entirely. So for example, let's take the analogy of a person who has been granted by Allah Azza wa Jal infinite knowledge of everything. Well, we don't need to take an example, a hypothetical example. We can take the example of someone that was granted some knowledge by Allah Azza wa Jal, and that is Amirul Mu'mineen on the battlefield when he's fighting against people that openly decided to fight against him. Malik al-Ashtar asks him, how many did you kill, O Amir al-Mu'mineen? And he tells him a number. Malik al-Ashtar says, well, I killed the same amount, so I'm surprised. And Amir al-Mu'mineen says, well, when I'm killing, I see 7 generations down the line. Now, can you imagine we lived in a world where we knew someone that could do that? And you would see them swerve when it comes to some people, and when it comes to other people, you might see them not show the same level of care to avoid things happening. So for example, a boy that's going to become Hitler times 10, maybe that person would feel that if they had this knowledge, that boy getting harmed in a car crash isn't the worst thing in the world. But you see, it's impossible for us to conceptualize this because, alhamdulillah, we're not in that situation. We don't have that knowledge.
So we could argue that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't like to intervene in worldly affairs, given the concept of free will and predetermination. So could that be something that we could argue back to the atheists and say that Allah as a creator has a hands-off approach almost?
Hands-off approach to a certain degree. Obviously, we believe that Allah Azza wa Jal places people within the best place and the best time for them to have what we would call the potentiality to achieve the best for them. But unfortunately, sometimes people choose to do the absolute worst. So when Allah Azza wa Jal placed us in these circumstances, He intended for us the best.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a very wide and a very deep discussion, the notion of evil. Just before we run out of time, I just wanted to hand the mic over to yourself. If you wanted to conclude any points that we haven't covered in this discussion, I'll leave the concluding comments to yourself.
I do think, dear viewers, that it's necessary for us to always focus on the fact that whilst we are Muslims, whilst we are Shia, whilst we have a worldview that we are to inherit from the Ahlul Bayt and that we are to rationalize according to what Ahlul Bayt have taught us, we are nonetheless products of the Western world and, of course, the dominant worldview of the Western world, which is liberalism. And liberalism, of course, teaches that we as human beings have autonomy and deserve freedom. Now, of course, one book which I advise that all viewers who are very interested in this topic read is a book called The Importance of Suffering, The Value and Meaning of Emotional Discontent by the psychologist James Davies. Within this book, Davies cites works done by anthropologists and sociologists who have demonstrated that when it comes to people outside of the Western world, who have not been influenced by the worldview of liberalism, they tend to view suffering a lot more stoically. That is to say, that they transform suffering from something negative and stop moaning about it, and rather consider that there are things known as productive suffering. How certain forms of suffering allow you to become the best person that you can, instead of just viewing everything through the lens of victim complex. And I think it's important to remember that when we look at these things, because unfortunately, sometimes we are very influenced by our surroundings, and that's all I have to say on this topic. But perhaps we may return for one more episode on this, because I want to engage with this argument called the evil God argument, which is getting quite popular these days.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much for your time, Sheikhna. It's been an eye-opening discussion, and if there is or isn't a continuation of this discussion, likewise we'll come back for further episodes and have further discussions, inshallah, in the future.
Inshallah.
Thank you very much for your time.
No problem at all.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikhna.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.